Abraham as famine refugees, asylum seekers, who have been given a welcome and the means to survive in Egypt. Which is great, of course. I mean, at least they've been saved from extinction. But then Egypt's not the land that God had promised to Abraham. So, coming to the book of Exodus in broadest outline, it begins with the Israelites flourishing, yes, but stuck in Egypt. So the book ends at the very closing verses of chapter 40 with them getting out of Egypt and on the move at last towards the promised land, and a great deal of excitement in between the beginning and the end of the book. When we think about the structure of the book, it seems to fall into three main sections. Chapters 1 to 15 is basically the narrative of redemption. This is how God rescued the Israelites from what had become unbearable suffering and slavery in Egypt. I mean, they had multiplied as a nation, but now they were being exploited and oppressed as an immigrant ethnic minority, treated as a slave labor force for the Egyptian king, who's called the Pharaoh. But then, through a miraculously rescued baby, who grows up to be a prince in Pharaoh's own family, Moses, of course, God achieves an equally miraculous rescue of his people in a massive act of judgment on Egypt and redemption for Israel as they get across the Red Sea to freedom. And that brings us to chapter 15. And then chapters 16 to 24 in the center of the book, they describe how God brought those people into a covenant relationship with himself after he's got them to Mount Sinai. Having redeemed them out of Egypt, he declares that they must now serve and worship him alone, because now they know this God, Yahweh God, as the one and only true God. And at this point, God reveals his name to them and says to them, I will be your God and you will be my people. And then, having saved them, he gives to them clear guidance as to how they are now to live in relation to God and to one another as a whole society, so that they could be his living representatives, we might say, among all the other nations. God calls them a priestly people, a holy nation, in chapter 19. And then that guidance from God to his people takes the form of the laws that we find in this section of the book. The people, on the one hand, they willingly agree and gratefully agree to obey God's laws, and the covenant that God makes with them is then sealed in a ceremony that includes sacrifices and a meal in the presence of God himself. That all takes you up to chapter 24. But then the question then becomes, how can that relationship with God, which is established there at Mount Sinai, how can it be sustained when they leave the mountain, Mount Sinai, where God's presence had come down so powerfully? And that leads us then to the third great section of the book of Exodus, which is chapters 24 to 40, which are all taken up with the presence of God among his people and how it was very nearly lost altogether. How can the God who has shaken a whole mountain with earthquake and cloud and fire in chapter 19, how can this God live among his people? How can he travel with them when they move? So God says, make a tent for me, and then I can come down and dwell in the midst of them on their journey. So God gives Moses instruction for a rather special tent, which we often call the tabernacle, with various pieces of furniture inside and outside, and priests who will serve God in that place. So that tabernacle, you see, that will be a safe place, a holy space, a dwelling place, and indeed a meeting place for God to communicate with the people through Moses. So here we have God in a tent, living among people in tents. But while Moses is up there on the mountaintop receiving these instructions from God, a terrible thing happens at the foot of the mountain, which is described in chapter 32, because the people get impatient and they demand that Aaron, who was Moses' older brother, that he should